of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. My name is Nick Pitts, and I am guest hosting today. And we've got around the round table, the Millennial Roundtable, we've got the honorary millennial, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you. Very good.
The man, the myth, the legend. And he is joined by Miss Chelsey Youman of First Liberty Institute. And how are you doing, Chelsey?
I am well.
Okay, so I feel like I have to mention this at the forefront, Chelsey.
It's
I
okay.
apologize.
I'm still recovering.
I
It's fine.
apologize. Okay, so for our listeners, Chelsey went to Texas A&M University,
That's
home
right.
of the Fighting Aggies. Okay, and so there are many listeners that are outside of Texas right now. And so I came from outside of Texas, and I didn't realize how big a deal Texas A&M is.
Well, not to brag or anything, but we were the first institution of higher education in the state of Texas. So we're actually pretty big. I mean, we're almost as big as UT. And now that we joined the SEC, we're really getting a lot more traction than we used to.
I completely agree. And so I didn't realize, I mean, they're high fandom. They don't sit down. Students
Right.
don't sit down
No.
during football
12th
games.
man.
There's all these traditions, and I mean, it really is just something else. And so,
It's right.
So when I came here to Texas, I was just overwhelmed by it because it's really pretty stark. You either love Texas A&M or you don't love
Right.
Texas.
They say that from the outside looking in, you don't understand it, but from the inside looking out, it's just a big family. And it's like a cult in some ways, but I'm already indoctrinating my 9-month-old son.
So just so you all know, this past weekend on Sunday, the family mourned. The Texas A&M family mourned. I was in Denver this weekend, and I had gone to dinner, and Texas A&M was up 44-10.
Right.
And then before you know it, I get back from dinner, and all of a sudden, I'm seeing these breaking news alerts that you guys lost.
Right. We enabled the biggest comeback in history. We're on the wrong side of the comeback, but hey, we're still part of history.
Yeah, of course. I love the perspective on it. And so it's been quite a weekend. It's been quite a weekend for college football.
Well, let's talk about your weekend, too, because you went back to your alma mater. Not too many of us are invited back to the college from which we graduated to deliver a message. That's pretty impressive.
I had to stay away from the library because I probably have overdue fines from some book that I checked out there. Yeah, so I was at Austin Peay State University in Tennessee yesterday, actually. And so was there for trying to encourage teachers that were at the beginning of the year. For those that are subscribers to the Daily Briefing, and then also for individuals that have been listening for a while, I did this Twitter hashtag campaign called Teaching Nick Was the Pits. And just I graduated with my PhD just this past year, and I spent one every day for 23 days before I graduated, and I dedicated it to a teacher and just tried to say thank you to that teacher as well as what that teacher taught me. And so for 23 days, I just tried to encourage my former teachers, but also current teachers that are trying to make their way through the school year. And so I had parents that blessed me, and then teachers that carried me, especially the math ones. So it was good to be back on the old stomping grounds where it's appropriate to yell, "Let's go pee." I know that that's not probably appropriate in about 49 other states, but it's very appropriate. Do you guys have chants like that at A&M?
Yes, they're not chants. We have yells.
Oh, yells. Oh,
They're
I
very
apologize.
choreographed and organized.
Yell leaders.
Yell leaders. No
Yes,
cheerleaders.
okay.
Yell leaders.
That's so great. Well, we're so excited that you decided to join us this today, and what we're going to be talking about is just a variety of things. We're going to kind of be touching and overview DACA, as Kerby kind of alluded to yesterday and really spent some time on. We're going to look at it from a millennial perspective, and then we've also got some really interesting articles that are available on the website. So if you want to make your way over there to pointofview.net, we've got 4 articles that are listed today that I think are really going to be very interesting and bring about a robust conversation. We'll talk about DACA, as well as we'll talk about Christians and kind of the dating pool, and then the decreasing numbers that are actually getting married. We'll move into The Fragile Generation by Jonathan Haidt, who's over at NYU University, and then we'll kind of end on patriot prayer and free speech. But also, we're going to be taking some of your phone calls as well. So if you'd like to have your point of view heard, you can call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. And so we'll jump right into it right now. Kerby, there has been so much that's talked about how Donald Trump hates children. And so help us better understand this, Kerby.
Well, let's go back. This DACA is called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And back in 2012, President Obama decided to do what Congress was not going to do, and that is they did not pass what's called the DREAMER Act. And so he then allowed for a functional amnesty, if you will, for those under the age of 37. Now, there has always been a tenuous nature to that. I had always thought that this was an executive order. I found out just recently it was actually a memo, because an executive order is subject to judicial review. And back then, you might remember how Judge Scalia, Justice Scalia might have, along with 4 other justices, struck it down. So we've had this sort of situation with DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, for some time. Candidate Donald Trump said he, day one, was going to cancel it, has decided not to. And one of the questions that came up yesterday, Nick, was why yesterday? Well, it so happens that simultaneously we've had a number of attorney generals, including the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, bringing a lawsuit. And by doing this, it prevented the lawsuit from going any further. And thus now says you have 6 months, Congress, to do something about this. And if Congress has not done anything by March 5th, 2018, then you will no longer have the protection of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so I think this is really a good idea. I know some people, including the former president, thought this was mean-spirited and everything else. But if you want to go back to the Constitution, that's a good idea, and the rule of law, this says that this action should be done not by an executive signing his pen, but should be done by Congress. And now I think it puts the onus on Congress to do something about this between now and March 5th.
Yeah, Chelsey, I was so shocked by the reaction. I was shocked, but I wasn't shocked by the reaction against Trump on this, because at the end of the day, he was really just trying to abide by the rule of the law, one, and then do what the delineation of powers is always set out to do, which is allow Congress to be the one to make the rules and not the president to continue to overreach the rules.
You're so right. I mean, this puts us back in the hands of Congress, whose duty it is to make permanent laws, and laws that we can rely on, laws that are established, that are predictable, so that the general public understands the rules that are at play. And then it's the executive's role to really enforce those laws. And I think that's the biggest shame to me of this whole DACA situation, is that the Obama administration has, for a course of 8 years, implemented executive orders and misled the American public. The American public's tended to think anything he did, especially with all rights, SOGI rights, all of those rights that were involved, were all done by memoranda and executive orders, and those aren't permanent laws in place. And then we have people relying on what they think is the law, and there's a fundamental misunderstanding. But I also think it's important to note that there are other laws on the books to help prevent just a mass exodus of immigrants from our country. So juveniles can still seek special juvenile status if they are here or orphaned. You can seek refugee status. You can seek a visa if you're either here legally, you entered our country, or you've married a U.S. citizen. There are still plenty of other immigration rules and favorable laws on the books for people to seek their status here.
Yeah, and it makes me glad that we have a lawyer here today
me too.
to talk about this. And so if you'd like to air your point of view, be sure to call us in at 800-351-1212. When we come back, we're going to talk about the millennial reaction to this, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, hate labels have been thrown around quite a bit lately. Much of that started with the Southern Poverty Law Center. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, the group used to provide a valuable service, but now throws the hate label around irresponsibly. Their hate map identifies groups that deserve the label: white supremacists, neo-Nazis, with many others that do not, like the Family Research Council, the American Family Association, and Alliance Defending Freedom. Unfortunately, too many other organizations take them seriously. In July, I wrote about GuideStar slapping a hate group label on certain groups merely because they were so designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center. For now, they have removed that label. Now foundations like the Clooney Foundation and businesses like Apple have donated up to $1 million to the Southern Poverty Law Center. No wonder they can now afford to take out full-page ads in USA Today. On August 23rd, Dr. Frank Wright, president of the D. James Kennedy Ministries, announced that the ministry filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court against the Southern Poverty Law Center. The lawsuit alleges that the center illegally trafficked in false and misleading descriptions of the services offered by the ministry and committed defamation against the ministry arising from the publication and distribution of false information that libels the ministry's reputation and subjects the ministry to disgrace, ridicule, odium, and contempt in the estimation of the public. Another concern is the overuse and misuse of the hate label. We no longer seem to have an adequate public vocabulary to describe real haters and racists. Here's a suggestion. If we want to end hate in America, maybe we should start by accurately defining it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View, and I'm joined by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman of First Liberty Institute. And we were just talking about DACA, Kerby, right before we took one of those breaks, and was just so interested to see just the visceral reaction that came both from the right and the left on this. So DACA is kind of give it scope and scale. It's around 800,000 people, and so Donald Trump President Trump gave us gave Congress the opportunity for 6 months to be able to come up with something. To come up with the legislation to be able to enact some of DACA.
Well, and again, Congress could simply come up with a way to address this in an orderly fashion. The National Review suggests that this would be a good time to do two other things. Implement E-Verify so that the various employers would know whether a person's there legally or illegally, and then maybe even try to bring in some of the aspects of what is called the RAISE Act, which would give a point system, try to revise some things that were changed back in 1965. But the easy vote, this seems like an easy up or down vote. I want to hear from both of you because this was controversial back in 2012, and I still say why. Most Americans, last survey I saw, 78% said we would not want to actually deport dreamers, those individuals who were brought here by their parents who have qualified for this program. In other words, to qualify this program, you can't have a criminal record. You probably are already an outstanding member of society. Americans are not ready to deport them, and so this seems like a pretty simple vote. Can anybody explain why it's so
Chelsey,
controversial?
I'm so confused by this because it seems like it's pretty easy, right? Like, again, I know Congress has got a lot on their plate right now relative to the debt ceiling, relative to Harvey relief. Irma is looming down the way right now. This seems like one of those easy things that Congress can come together on.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right. Congress can come together. They can come up with a solution. Even Trump hedged his bet by saying we're not going to have mass deportation.
Yeah.
There's a 6-month phase out, and at that point they're going to reevaluate if Congress hasn't done anything. So I think actually we might be more on the same page than we all think we are. But of course, with the media and the left, they're going to sensationalize this and take every opportunity they can to make this seem like more of the narrative of the Trump is a racist narrative.
Yeah, you know what? I just find it so fascinating one, because I'm frustrated because it seems like we've been talking about this since 1980.
Oh, yes. As old as I am, thinking what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
And so I put in the daily briefing a clip of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush during the 1980 presidential primary,
right?
GOP primary debate, and they're talking about compassionate conservative, talking about being compassionate and fiercely abiding by the rule of the law. And that conversation's happening in 1980, and I'm grateful that it was happening in 1980. I'm discouraged that it continues to happen in 2017. It's one thing for us to continue to be talking about Texas A&M and why they're not being. No, I'm just kidding. I wasn't even
that is something else. You're right.
We will change the topic.
But I'm just extremely discouraged by this, and especially from a millennial standpoint, Chelsey. I'd be really interested to hear. Millennials are very much keenly aware and very sensitive to relationships. And we have grown up in a world that's drastically more diverse than our parents and our grandparents. And so I can think about, I know there's 800,000 of them. I can think about individuals that I know that are a part of DACA that very much so would be influenced by this and affected by this.
That is definitely something we have to talk about as a millennial perspective. I think that for better or worse, what you're saying about them being very cognizant of relationships and the old phrase human rights violations, not necessarily the newer term that connotates, but overall studies have shown that millennials very, very much do care about what's in the public interest and public responsibility. And so this probably goes along with that. Also, if you think of how well the left has just owned the verbiage on all issues, really, they're now calling these immigrants dreamers, and I think there's like a romanticism involved with and for everyone that someone can come to our country and start new and begin a life here. I mean, it's something that we as a country have really opened our arms to a lot in the past. Now, when we get into the nitty gritty of how those laws are enforced, that's where they owe it to themselves to be educated and say, look here, we're not going to kick out 800,000 people in our country. Yeah. There are some practical ways that we can find resolutions, but we still need to find a resolution.
And Kerby, I think this is one of the things I'd be really interested to hear from you, just based upon millennials have this keen sense and keen sensitivity towards relationships. They don't want to deter those. They don't want to harm those. And like I said, that they're increasingly in a more diverse populace. I have friends that would be affected by this should, in the very small chance, this actually go through and there be mass deportations, which is not going to happen. Not going to happen. So what was it? But I'm just so discouraged by millennial voting and millennial engagement in the political process. What was it about when in the 60s and 70s, when there was just that palpable sense of energy? What was it, do you think, that really brought about that sense of, I'm not going to be apathetic towards government, but I'm really going to try to engage it to the extent that we really can begin to leverage some of the change that we feel so socially active about?
Well, we go back in history a little bit. In the 1960s, it was a time in which you had this massive humanity, the baby boom generation, going through kind of a teenage rebellion. So that was happening while you had the civil rights movement and you had the Vietnam War. So that created a tremendous amount of activism. By the time you got in the 1970s, that might have faded, and then you had something called Watergate. And then again, you had a split. You had some people that began to be very skeptical and cynical about the government. But you also had a number of other people that said, wait a minute, they had that same dynamism. We need to do something about it, and which is why a lot of them went into journalism. They wanted to be the next Woodward Bernstein. Yeah. They wanted to be the muckrakers that dealt with that. And so then you went through the malaise, and by the time you got to Ronald Reagan, there was kind of, well, it's America. It's morning again in America was one of his themes. And as you pointed out, with this issue of immigration, they honestly thought back then that if we can pass a very significant but limited amnesty law in 1986, that would be sufficient to deal with the problem, and then we'd secure the borders and we wouldn't have to deal with it again. Didn't turn out that way, as you well know. And so that's where we find ourselves today, where we are still not even sure how many illegal immigrants we have in this country. We have a pretty good estimate that we have 800,000 dreamers, but we've sort of lost control of our country. We've lost control of our borders, and maybe that's one of the reasons why this was so controversial just a few years ago, to just do something which now we're looking at seems pretty straightforward and not that controversial.
Yeah, so I guess we would just say, Chelsey, so as the millennial lawyer, though I've watched plenty of Law and Order, just so you know, should you need help.
I can't help with that. Don't call me if you're a criminal. I can't help.
That's not what you do.
Wish I could.
And no divorces either. She told us that last time. Don't call about divorce.
So as the millennial lawyer, someone one that's keenly aware of just millennial sensitivity towards relationships, but understands the significance of the rule of law. Help us to be able to understand why this isn't necessarily a bad thing, why this is a pretty good thing, and how millennials can begin and get engaged in this.
Well, the reason this is a good conversation to have now is we need permanence in our law.
Right.
As I said, we need our rights to be established. We need them to be written down. We need a system in place so that it is organized and that people don't have the rug pulled out from underneath them like what we're seeing is happening right now. And there are solutions out there. We are a democracy, people. So if we don't like the way the system is going, that's within our power to change, to get involved, to help call our legislators, have them draft the right legislation, and have a sense of permanency, which we should have, citizens or not. There should be a sense of normalcy and permanency. And the other thing is, I just want to emphasize to everyone out there that the law is not without compassion, and that we can still have compassion in the way that we go about these processes, that there are already a lot of rules on the books in immigration that I think people would be surprised just how compassionate our immigration laws are. So those are just the two things I would emphasize.
Yeah, Kerby, I think she brings up a really great point in that there's compassion within the laws, but then to also understand that we have the opportunity to change the laws as well. We need to abide by the laws that are on the books, but also recognize the truth that we the people have a government that is for the people and by the people, and to be able to change the laws, to be able to, one, stay true to security, but also, two, recognize that we're a diverse nation, and that's really our strength.
Yes. Well, again, we want to prevent what is happening right now, as we were talking about the monuments and the statues, what I call mob rule, where just the loudest voice or the few activists move everything in the culture. This is a good example to get away from the mob rule for just a minute and say, let's have a reasonable conversation about and how to implement this. And in most cases, people would say these dreamers are ones we want to be part of our citizenship, but we also would like a system that would not only be compassionate, but have some discernment. Because if you have an individual here who's part of a gang, maybe doesn't have a criminal record yet, but has some misdemeanors, and you're really a little bit less concerned about whether or not they're going to be a good citizen, we would like a system that would certainly give us the best, but also recognize that there might be some bad apples in the midst of 800,000. We need to figure out how to deal with that as well.
I completely agree. It's just this sense that we need to understand that we do have a rule of law, and that's to be able to kind of restrain evil and to be able to compel good, to allow individuals to be able to move out and do well within our system of government. One might say to be able to pursue after happiness. But then, two, we need to recognize the truth that we need to have a system where right now there are 800,000, but who knows how many good people also are out there right now, that we have the opportunity to allow them to have safe means and secure means that they might be able to come to the land of the free and home of the brave. When we come back, we're going to continue. We're going to be talking about Christians and the dating pool and the uptick, the uptick in singleness and the downtick in marriage. And we'll be back right after this.
At dinner recently, I was struck by the couple in front of me. They were allegedly spending a night out together, but the only time they communicated in a half hour was one time when the man showed what was on his phone to the woman, and then back to their own screens. We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You'll find us online with your phone, your tablet, your laptop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues. You can also follow our new YouTube video series, Uncensored. Stay informed. Follow us on Twitter at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Again, at Point of View RTS. We'd love you to retweet us, to share our Facebook posts, but please don't do it when you're out with your family or someone you love. We can wait. We're online 24 hours a day. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And we are back on Point of View, and I'm joined at the round table by Mr. Kerby Anderson and Miss Chelsey Youman, and this is the Millennial Roundtable. So we got through talking about DACA. We're going to kind of jump into something a little bit different, and that's going to be this Washington Post op-ed that came out yesterday, and you'll be able to find that on our website at pointofview.net. And it talked about the changing understanding of marriage, of sexuality among millennials. And so, Kerby, contra to Frank Sinatra's 1955 hit, Love and Marriage, to a millennial do not go together like a horse and carriage anymore.
Well, and that is something that started before your generation, so let's put the blame where the blame belongs.
If you insist.
And that is to recognize that from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, really in just a little over 10 years, the divorce rate doubled. And that's because the post-war generations, and that's the baby boomers, tended to view marriage different than those born before the end of World War II, what many people call the builder generation. So the builder generation was very high on commitment. Mom and dad stayed together for the sake of the kids. And when the divorce rate went up, at first people thought, well, it was the builder generation deciding to throw in the towels once the kids got out of college. Nope, it was all the younger generation. So you have, first of all, with the boomers, then the busters, now the millennials, kind of a different view of marriage. And that has also followed another trend, and that is that when you look at those individuals who were living together, and we don't have very good statistics from the 1960s, but I've written a book on it, so I've kind of dug into it a little bit. You had very, very few from the 60s on that were living together, even though we talked about it. But the number of people cohabiting has increased almost exponentially. And so you're now in a generation where you've seen your parents, the millennials have seen many of their parents or the friends of their parents divorce, and they've said, you know, I really don't think I want to get married because I'm fearful about marriage. And besides, with the change in sexuality, the article here that I love, the title of his new book, published by Oxford University Press, called Cheap Sex. Well, that's what he calls it. That is available. And so with high levels of sexual promiscuity and high levels of cohabitation, you have fewer and fewer people getting married in the millennial generation.
There is so much to talk about with this, Chelsey, and so we'll just kind of take this piecemeal and we'll kind of work through this. The first, we'll go through divorce, singleness, marriage, and then sexuality, just from a millennial standpoint. And then Kerby will always bring in his keen analysis here and there. And so I don't know about you, Chelsey, but when I have friends that have come from divorced families, it really does significantly change their understanding of marriage today.
I absolutely find that to be true. Just a much more increased hesitancy in wanting to commit, and not always out of, a lot of times mostly out of fear that it wouldn't work out or that they're not going to have what it takes. And these are things that they've told me, you know, to keep a marriage going. They've never really seen it modeled. So yeah, I see that a lot. I also looked up some of the same statistics from the Pew Research Center that cohabitation has increased to 30%. Across the board, but a lot of the increase in cohabitation also happens with the 50 and over crowd, and so I think it's something that's a phenomenon happening nationwide. But the Pew Research Center also did some research on millennials, reasons why people are not married. And the number one reason for millennials, they said, is they don't feel financially prepared. So 35% of millennials say they think they need to be more financially prepared. And then the next highest would be 30% almost say they haven't found what they're looking for.
Yeah, Kerby, I think that was so fascinating because Chelsey brings up a great point. I read this in another Washington Post article that said that there used to be a day that individuals would, one, get married, then look for a house. And so you had it portrayed on TV a lot of the times as you're living in these just awful, really meager, I wouldn't say awful, just meager circumstances. You're eating mac and cheese together. You're just struggling together. And then eventually you move to the house. Whereas what Chelsey illuminated today, there's individuals that very much are much more inclined towards wanting to buy a house, get their lives together, and then bring somebody into their already existing life.
Well, and again, the old rhyme about first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby carriage. Well, those are completely reversed, because first comes my house, then maybe comes my baby, then baby becomes my marriage. I mean, we changed the whole success syndrome and the sequencing around, in large part because, first of all, it's even talking about in this particular article here that even Christians are buying into that kind of secular mindset. So it isn't just the millennials that are secular, which are the predominant number of individuals that are in the millennial generation, but it's even the Christian millennials are buying into the same kind of idea because of those ideas that are out there.
Yeah, and so Chelsey, I'd be really interested to continue to hear some of your thoughts. And so we'll go back to divorce for a second, because I think that's one of the... And if there's any divorce listeners, just know that there's grace available, and there's a God that works, and he's so gracious in what he does. But just the extent that divorce it doesn't just hurt the two individuals that were once a part of that marital union, but it has ripple effects onto the whole larger culture. And to have individuals, specifically millennials, that are sitting front row to watching true love kind of die before them, it really does create what you talked about, a sense of fear of, can that happen to me, right? And two extents, and just I've written a little bit on this at Huffington Post, and there's two extents that I think you can see that. One, because there's this understanding within divorce of, I saw something that one spouse saw that they didn't like anymore that caused them to split. So it either causes one, them to close up, or two, them to guard up, in the extent that they won't really reveal themselves to fully give, like in Song of Solomon, I am my lover and my lover is mine, to the extent. And so we're just seeing divorce continue to play out with that fear component, which I think is just so significant that you were alluding to.
Right, and it's also something that builds on itself. And so my husband and I volunteer at a premarital class at our church, and we had a speaker come, and he did the largest psychological longitudinal study on the effects of what he calls sliding versus deciding. And so this fear and this hesitancy to commit actually backfires later and leads again to a cycle of divorce, because he says people will slide into the commitment of marriage. So they'll they're sexually promiscuous, they move in with one another, the toothbrush gradually stays over, and then they gradually just kind of decide they're going casually to get engaged and then married. And then they say later the psychological effect of that is that the couple cannot look back and say, this was the moment we decided to commit. We slid into commitment. And that plays out a very big role for them in their ability to commit to fight for that marriage and to stay in that marriage. So I think it's just really sad and detrimental impact that fear ends up having. It's not to say just go marry the first person you find. Yeah. But as a Christian, your basis for your commitment it should be rooted in being equally yoked, and both have a Christ-like love for each other and pursue the Lord in their own walks. And then that enables the marriage to stay strong and thrive. Yeah.
So there's even statistical analysis that would give us a number as to give a number to that fear. And so individuals that are coming from divorced families, it's anywhere from 50 to 70% are likely themselves to be a divorce. And divorce is just a painful thing if you're a child that's walking through that. But then we're also seeing kind of what you're talking about, of individuals that are just staying single longer. And so we've seen the drastic uptick, Kerby, in the number and the individuals that aren't getting married until later in life. 29 if you're a male, 27 if you're a female, which is drastically much higher than what it traditionally has been.
You know what? It was so interesting is, again, when I looked at some of those statistics back in the 1960s, the Census Bureau has adults living alone. Actually, it's males living alone, females living alone. And back in the 60s, it was widows, widowers, and maybe even a few individuals that had graduated from college living at home, but most did not. And now those numbers are just off the charts, as we just shared just a minute ago. And as Chelsey pointed out, it isn't just the millennial generation. It is the older generation saying, I don't want to lose my Social Security benefits, so we'll just live together. And it's this kind of this pervasive idea that I talk about in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. I have a chapter there on cohabitation because I ran into so many pastors saying, what do I say to individuals other than, or after I give them the biblical text, they go, yeah, but is there any other reason? Well, yeah, there's a lot of reasons. Your likelihood of getting divorced is 50% higher if you live together before marriage. But if you buy the argument that, I wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on, I wouldn't buy a car without a test drive, But I always point out, yeah, but the car doesn't get offended if you decide not to buy the car, and you don't leave some of your belongings in the trunk of the car and all sorts of other things. But the bottom line is that we now know how devastating divorce is. We now know how devastating living together before marriage is. And yet, nevertheless, we still end up doing it more than we would have ever imagined just a few decades ago.
You can return shoes for free on Amazon. Just so, no, I'm just kidding.
Can you? I actually want to know that.
What about those stilettos we were talking about last week, right?
Yeah, exactly. But so when we come back from the break, I'm going to be really interested. I'm going to poke and prod on Chelsey for a little bit about this online dating component that's going to. So even to the extent 2 days ago, Tinder introduced a new feature on their app, where Tinder is this online dating app that you can swipe left or swipe right depending on whether you like them. You swipe right if you like them, swipe left if you don't like them. If you like each other, then you can kind of connect. Well, there's been significant failure rate on Tinder because you don't realize how many times you're being rejected. But now they introduced a new feature where you can pay $4.99 and you can find out who actually swiped right to you, who liked you. And so that's caused them an uptick. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of the effects of what's happening on singles here in the U.S. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1987, the Supreme Court was asked whether timbering operations within a national park over a portion of land traditionally used for religious purposes by Native Americans violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. Justice O'Connor's opinion in Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association concluded that, quote, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the land in question did not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land, unquote. But not all the justices agreed. Justice Brennan, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, disagreed. He reasoned that the timbering in question threatened the, quote, very existence of a Native American religion. He concluded on a somber note, quote, today the court holds that a federal land use decision that promises to destroy an entire religion does not burden the practice of that faith in a manner recognized by the Free Exercise Clause. I find it difficult, however, to imagine conduct more insensitive to religious needs, unquote. 13 years later, Congress would pass the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. At the least, RLUIPA would have required the government to demonstrate that its actions were the least restrictive in pursuit of a compelling government interest. RLUIPA, like RFRA, insists that government actions substantially burdening the free exercise of religion receive heightened scrutiny. That protects all of our religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back back on Point of View, and I'm joined by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman around the roundtable. And so we've been talking about dating advice, and Kirby's been giving us date advice. No. I'm just kidding. Chelsea's been doing that.
Yeah, Chelsea's good at that.
That's true.
And so we have been talking about on our website, you'll notice on pointofview.net, you'll notice that we've got 4 articles that are posted. One of those articles we've been talking about right now is concerning on the Washington Post, and talking about Christians in the sense of what divorce has done to millennial Christians, as well as the kind of rising rates of singleness and cohabitation and the view of marriage and sexuality. And so we've been talking about that a little bit. But Chelsey, you brought up a great point during the break that I'd love for you to be able to share relative to kind of these 4 kind of civic sanctifying institutions. Sure.
So the theory that I've, discussed a lot, especially in my office with my coworkers, has been that there are 4 really pillars of the family, that's going to be permanence in the relationship, exclusivity of a marriage and relationship. It's 2 people and no more. Complementarity between the genders, that 2 are better than 1, and then also the reproductive nature of a marriage that comes with childbearing. But we have really seen in history, starting in the 60s, we really saw an eradication of now we have free sex, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no birth or reproductive purposes a lot of the times in this casual sex culture that we have. So that pillar was kind of eradicated then. And then we had no-fault divorce, which eradicated the permanency of marriage and the family union. And then most recently, we've seen eradication of the complementarity, that there is no real difference between the genders, that we shouldn't acknowledge any differences between the gender. And so a lack of that. And then the 4th and final, I'm sure we'll see go, that's predicted, is exclusivity. Essentially, we've seen the rise of thruples. I'm not sure if many of our listeners even know what that is, where now instead of 2 people in a relationship, you can have 3 or 4 or more. So it's really, really what we've seen a lot is the demise of the family unit in our culture, which of course is going to lead to higher divorce rates and more uncertainty within family units. Now that it's not just society, really. It's like the values that stabilize society. Yeah,
and Kerby, we were talking about that as well over the break, the unintended consequences, because marriage and the family unit is one of those basic building blocks of community, that when marriages are good, communities thrive. And what are the unintended consequences of individuals not getting married later, and then just to go on and on and on.
There was a book that came out years ago. Maggie Gallagher was one of the authors of it. She's been on the program with us, that married people are happier, healthier, and more financially stable. And it is just chock full of those kinds of studies. And you can go to the Heritage Foundation and find these studies. You can go to Family Research Center and find these studies. You can look your way through many of these journals and find out that generally married people do better in life. Children in intact families do better in life. Now, are there exceptions? Of course there are. We love to use the Ben Carson stories and things like that, which are, I think, encouraging to single mothers out there. But the reality is marriage is very good for a society. Couples and individuals that live together but are not married are not good for society. Family stability is something we need to talk about as well, because there is something about marriage. Even though we have the high divorce rates, we still have a lot of people that stay married, and that permanence and that security allows children to do better. When you have a divorce taking place, we find that almost instantaneously there are economic impacts. There are educational impacts. It's almost like they're 1 year behind in school because of all the emotional trauma. And then, of course, the other E is their emotional impacts. So the 3 E's of divorce are really concerning as well. That's why we have seen in any culture around the world that they like to emphasize marriage. And we have been in a social experiment, first in Europe, now in the United States, of redefining marriage. We redefined it because of divorce. We've now redefined it in terms of same-sex marriage. And as Chelsey points out, it looks like we're redefining it in terms of even the issue of permanence or exclusivity in marriage today.
Yeah, and so as an individual that is not married, I'm the only one that's single at the round table. It's very interesting just to be able to see the redefinition of marriage and then what the implications and the factors are kind of moving into this. Among millennials right now, it's very interesting. It's interesting to know that there are more millennials that are living at home than are actually living with the spouse right now.
Yes.
And so isn't that stunning?
I am flabbergasted by that.
That is staggering, but it is true. I've seen it in more than one place.
So there are, I think it's upwards of like 32 million millennials that are living at home right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I would gladly set up my friends right now. I'm going to start a dating service. Sounds like there's a need for it.
In fact, he just announced that he is single. Every mother that has a daughter.
So if you can call in at 800-351-1212.
Wouldn't Nick be a wonderful husband for you?
No,
haven't you heard this before, right?
I am a nerd.
I don't think I've ever seen him blush before, but it's happening right now.
Don't turn into the podcast, or I guess the video cast on Facebook right now. But nevertheless, I think it is very interesting. And so there's a book that I've referenced pretty frequently that helps us to be able to understand kind of the single component. And I'd be interested to hear Kerby's perspective on this. It's a book called Modern Romance. Aziz Ansari wrote it. It was the comedian that was in Parks and Rec, but also has done a couple of other things. And then he wrote it with a social scientist. And what they really did is they helped us to be able to better understand just the changing dynamics and the changing viewpoint of singleness today. There used to be a day back in a previous generation whereby there was just a sense that marriage was something that you needed one another. There was I need someone to do X, Y, and Z. I need someone else to do X, Y, and Z. So there was like a leaning, like I need one another to be able to do this. The feeling, the spark, the romance from the notebook or from the proposal, from the vow, I'm starting to see a commonality here. There's always
you watch
an
a lot of chick flicks?
Oh, I'm busted. And so there was just a sense that the fire and that emotional desire might come later in the marriage, but the beginning, what really initiates the marriage is I'm on my own and I need someone to be able to fulfill these duties. Now there's this changing shift in demographic whereby the passion is the thing that has to be present before an individual moves into that marital relationship. That needs are largely being taken care of, one, by themselves because they're working more or working into the economy, or two, these things called helicopter parents that are providing for those needs so they don't need to go out to individuals. It's just a radically different shift, Kerby.
And part of that was structural, and that is in the 19th century, we were primarily an agricultural society. And first of all, you needed a father and a mother, and you needed kids. And they did some estimates, some sociology professors did this, where they estimated that every child in that agrarian society gave a net benefit to your financial benefit of at least about $100,000. So these children were really valuable. Right now, my brother-in-law is going through harvest. You know, it's September right now, and it's all hands on deck, and they need not only all the kids, but all the other kids that are wanting to actually bring in the harvest. Well, now it's just the opposite. Every child is anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 net liability to your estate because you're paying for all the expenses. And then think about college. Get ready to make sure that you have enough money for foster there, right?
I don't even want to go there. He'll never, he's so young.
You won't have to think about that. But just think of how that is so different. And just also think about the fact that when you had a single parent income, Dad went off to work, Mom stayed home. Like it or not, that's what the 1950s were. Breadwinner, husband, homemaker, wife. Then you needed each other because if one person left, it kind of fell apart very quickly. Now, when Mom goes to work and Dad goes to work and we have equality of sexes and we have equal pay and all the things that I think are good, it also divides the family up in ways that never did before.
There's just an unintended consequences that's implicit within it. I think one of the studies that I found was so interesting. Forbes published a study that indicated that the average millennial receives $8,000 annually from their parents. And so, again, just another number, another statistic to point to the fact that millennials are largely still staying attached to mom and dad, though they're moving
financially attached.
Yeah, though they're moving away. And some of those needs just aren't necessary. They don't need to find those in another individual. They can find them in mom and dad. Now, if my mom and dad are listening, don't pay attention to any of that. I still welcome checks. And so when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about this as well as some other things. And so if you'd like to call in at 800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? You know, some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change, but how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens with You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. My name is Nick Pitts, and I am co-guest hosting today. I'm joined at the roundtable by Mr. Kerby Anderson. Hello, Mr. Anderson. How are you?
Very good. Good discussion this first hour, and if people are just joining us, we need to give them an update, because this has been really educational for all of us around the table, I would say.
I completely agree. We have been informed and enlightened by Miss Chelsey Youman as well, who's around the roundtable with First Liberty Institute. Chelsey, thank you so much for being here.
No, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So we have been talking about all sorts of things. So I think we've spanned the spectrum so far.
Yes.
During the first hour, we talked about everything from DACA and the upwards of 800,000 individuals, the dreamers that have the potential, that find themselves relying on Congress right now because of our president has decided to push it to Congress to be able to make a bill that would kind of give them security and stability. And then we started talking about, as Salt and Peppa said, we started talking about marriage, and we started talking about millennials changing views on sexuality. Do you see how
I don't think Salt and Pepper said that.
Yeah. Did you see it? I thought it would be too explicit to say it directly.
They didn't quite say it that way, yes.
Yeah, and so
Salt and Pepper?
Yeah, so I pulled myself back. I like to think that was this Holy Spirit, self-control.
Let's hope so.
There it was. And so we want to encourage you to be able to go to the website, pointofview.net, where you can see the articles that are listed today that we're talking about, as well as be sure to call in. If you'd like to have your opinion or like to share your point of view, you can call in at 800-351-1212. And before we left on the break, we're talking about just this understanding of marriage and how the millennial perspective is just changing drastically relative to marriage. And we're seeing some of the unintended consequences from that. There's a sense of fear, as Chelsey illuminated, relative to divorce that's causing individuals to want to stay single. And then those that are single, we're starting to see that there's a reliance upon families much more than there traditionally has been. And then we're seeing how marriage is just even being changed right now. Chelsey, share with our listeners one more time just this understanding that marriage really is this socially sanctifying, civically sanctifying institution. It's not just good for two individuals, but it's also good for the community as well.
Well, it's a basis for our community, for the family structured unit, for a core set of family values, and that's just that's sociology 101 there. I mean, this isn't just something we're saying because of the biblical perspective, we might share. It's that it's a basis for society to have a permanence of marriage, an exclusivity between two people in marriage, complementarity, which is part of the biblical concept that Adam, we know, needed Eve, and that she did complete him, and she was called his helper, and that they couldn't be their best without each other. And we also have in the Bible where it talks about how sanctifying marriage is, that Christ in the church is like a husband is to his wife, to sacrifice, and kind of that's some of the biblical narrative. And then the final would be obviously that marriage serves the purpose of creating life in our world, and that is good, and that that's how our earth repopulates itself. It's a good thing.
And Chelsey she did a phenomenal job of illuminating the sense that now we're getting into a world in which there's these things known as open marriages, where individuals are saying, and New York Times has dedicated 3 pieces in the past 2 months that I'm aware of towards these ideas of, Well, I have this marriage, but really marriage is all about the feels, I guess we should say. And among millennials, we would go #feels. Yes. And so when I'm not feeling it, I can just go to someone else in order that I can have that feeling yet again and then go back to that individual. But as Boston reminded us, it's more than a feeling. Is it Boston or Foreigner, Kerby? Do you remember? No? Okay, never mind. My 80s rock knowledge is not where it needs to be.
You're alone on this right now.
Gosh, okay.
I was thinking Katy Perry had something about feeling right now in one of her songs, right? That's where, everything she's saying.
I'm on Team Taylor, so I can't talk about Katy.
But nevertheless, there's also a changing in this understanding of sexuality as well, which we saw from the Nashville statement. And so, Kerby, help us understand this Nashville statement that came out.
I wondered if you're going to get to that, because your boss, our former boss, was writing about that today.
He was writing about it.
Okay, let's try to put this in some perspective. First of all, the Nashville statement has nothing to do with Nashville, as the mayor of Nashville points out.
Megan Barry wanted to make sure
that amazing?
Yeah.
But again, this is a statement where it's basically a who's who of the kind of people we've interviewed on this program many times before. And they say that even though this is a new document, it's ancient truths. And what they're basically setting forth is the idea that sex belongs between one man and one woman, that marriage is God's plan, and just some basic kinds of things that aren't all that controversial unless you publish that in the 21st century. This, if it were published in the 19th century or the 20th century, people go, and why are you even publishing it? Okay?
Yeah.
Even in the 1960s, people will be going, yeah, I understand that's what the church is all about. Well, it's a whole lot more controversial now, isn't it? Because you have another group of progressive Christians, and I use Christian in sort of quote, air quotes here, if you might. I think maybe some of them are saved and some of them are not. We'll leave that for God to sort out. But they have published another statement saying how, in a sense, this is mean-spirited, this is not accepting, it's not tolerant. And again, I'd love to get a comment or two from some of you millennials, because when you have a statement that really, in a sense, emphasizes not just biblical orthodoxy, but what has been kind of the warp and woof of Western culture for millennia, and that's controversial. You see that we're kind of in a different place, aren't we?
Yeah, Chelsey, I don't know if you have friends that are like this, but they would say something along the lines of, we've got to believe that we have a big enough tent that we can all be underneath, right? So those that are affirming of same-sex marriage and those that are not affirming of same-sex marriage, those that believe homosexual activity, not orientation, because I'm of the mind that that we're all broken by nature, and so orientation is not necessarily the thing to give attention to, but it's activity. That's the thing that, like all of us, we're by nature, and then we're also by action, we're broken individuals that are in need of grace and a Savior. But then there are those that are from the progressive side that are saying that the tent has to be big enough that we can all be Christians underneath it. When in reality, among millennials, that we are increasingly those that hold to a biblical sexual ethic, orthodox, historic. 68% of millennials believe that same-sex marriage is okay. There's just this sense that it's growing to the extent that we are in the minority now.
That statistic is definitely true, that we are in the minority. To some extent, I do think that that has changed quickly over the last few years. I wouldn't have said that about 5 years ago. When it came down to even voting, I think 70% of the time states voted to keep the traditional definition of marriage. Now, whether that was based on Christian beliefs or not, I'm not certain. But, the truth is that there should be a common set of values and a basic of Christian ethics in our country. It's a winnowing point for churches to either say, yes, we're going to stick with our biblical beliefs on these contentious social and cultural issues that are millennia-old beliefs, by the way. That's what First Liberty Institute's amicus brief in Obergefell was about, is how old these are 2 million-year-old traditions that to define marriage that way. It's a winnowing out for the church to say we're going to stand by and adhere to this set of ethics that we believe is scriptural or not.
Yeah, and so when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about the Nashville statement, because Kerby, I'm going to be interested. I'm going to play the devil's advocate with you, because I'm going to utilize my communications degree and try to say, is there a better way that we can communicate our stands? Because at the end of the day, we do need to take stands. But is there a better way to take a stand than this particular statement, at the timing as well? And we'd love to hear from you as well. So if you have a point of view you'd like to share with us, you can call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. And when we come back, we'll continue to talk about the Nashville statement right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, hate labels have been thrown around quite a bit lately. Much of that started with the Southern Poverty Law Center. As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, the group used to provide a valuable service, but now throws the hate label around irresponsibly. Their hate map identifies groups that deserve the label: white supremacists, neo-Nazis, with many others that do not, like the Family Research Council, the American Family Association, and Alliance Defending Freedom. Unfortunately, too many other organizations take them seriously. In July, I wrote about GuideStar slapping a hate group label on certain groups merely because they were so designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center. For now, they have removed that label. Now, foundations like the Clooney Foundation and businesses like Apple have donated up to $1 million to the Southern Poverty Law Center. No wonder they can now afford to take out full-page ads in USA Today. On August 23rd, Dr. Frank Wright, president of the D. James Kennedy Ministries, announced that the ministry filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court against the Southern Poverty Law Center. The lawsuit alleges that the center illegally trafficked in false and misleading descriptions of the services offered by the ministry and committed defamation against the ministry arising from the publication and distribution of false information that libels the ministry's reputation and subjects the ministry to disgrace, ridicule, odium, and contempt in the estimation of the public. Another concern is the overuse and misuse of the hate label. We no longer seem to have an adequate public vocabulary to describe real haters and racists. Here's a suggestion. If we want to end hate in America, maybe we should start by accurately defining it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View, and I am Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the round table by Mr. Kerby Anderson and Miss Chelsey Youman, and we have been talking about the Nashville Statement. And for those that are outside of Tennessee, we are not talking about how delicious the hot wings are in Nashville. Just coming
or the pork barbecue, which you always talk about.
Just a reminder of God's goodness and grace. Reminder of God's goodness and grace in this fall. I would be convinced if we had more pulled pork and we had more Hattie B's chicken. If Hattie B's wants to send me some chicken too, I'd be okay with that. If we had more Hattie B's hot chicken and pulled pork, the world would be a better place. But nevertheless, we have been talking about the Nashville Statement that came out, I guess, last week. Nashville Statement was just this a statement that was issued by evangelicals, evangelicals that believe it to be true, that are just sticking to what has been said for thousands of years, that that marriage is between one man and one woman, and homosexual behavior outside of marriage would be sinful. And Kerby, there's quite a few more signers that have actually signed on to this than
I guess.
we originally
I was
thought.
just looking at this at the break, and of course you had the 150 signers. And again, it's just a who's who, whether it's Jim Dobson or John MacArthur, certainly all sorts of individuals that you would know that are pastors, theologians, and the rest. Many more have signed on to it, but of course, as you well know, and we were just referring to, there's another group called Citizens, or I guess it's Christians United. Now, these tend to be more the liberal, progressive Christians or individuals that in one way or another say, no, we need to include people that are homosexual, bisexual, that maybe they're transgender and under this big tent. And so the real question is, was there a way to communicate this? And Jim Dobson, certainly has addressed this issue, but also Jim Denison talked about the fact that you only really have three opportunities. One is to choose silence. The other is to choose condemnation. And this is the idea to choose courage. But is there a way we could have communicated differently? I don't know. I mean, I'll leave that to others. But on the one hand, they say this is what we affirm, and then is what we deny. And then they go through all the kinds of issues that you would certainly want to address dealing with marriage, family, and sexuality.
Yeah, so one of the things, Chelsey, that was so interesting about the Nashville statement is that it came out last week. And so for those that are not familiar, Hurricane Harvey has been dominating the headlines last week. And so there were many that thought this was just bad timing, the sense that we're a country that's reeling right now, in the sense that we're watching what's happening to our fellow neighbor down in Houston area, and we're wondering why in the world would they poke their head up with this particular statement right now. So I don't know. I had a little bit of concern, I guess hesitation with the timing of it, but as for the substance, there wasn't really any concern as well.
Yeah, that does surprise me a little bit. I think that we're perhaps in a time of national, I would hope, unity over some of this terrible trauma that's occurring in Houston and maybe about to occur in Florida as well. So, yep, they probably weren't in touch with their number one PR person when they set this up.
And I think so. One of the things, Kerby, I'm really interested in is just the idea that is there a better way to communicate this very unpopular truth? Yeah. So it's not just the message that you bring, but it's the way that you convey the message. And I think this is just one of those issues that I think the outside world will see us as a stumbling block in it. That they're just never going to get on with the fact that we believe it to be true, that Christ Jesus has come to give us a life and a life to the fullest. And one of those ways is obeying his truths, because we know to love is to obey. And when we're seeking to love him with all our heart, it's obeying everything from not lying, as well as making sure that we keep the marriage bed undefiled, is what it says in Hebrews 13:4. But I think one of the concerns that I had, Kerby, and I don't know, maybe you can push back with me or agree with me, is this sense that there was no talk whatsoever about pornography in this, which I thought was just so fascinating, because they talked about chastity inside the marriage, or chastity outside marriage, but they didn't refer to chastity inside the marriage. And and again, there's so many individuals that have come on this program and talked about the pervasiveness of pornography in today's world. I wish there would have been more language that had at least some reference to it, because it's affecting so many others.
Oh, when you think about it, Jim Dobson was on the Attorney General's Commission report that dealt with pornography. Of course, we have this movie coming out. We talked about this last week, Heart of Man, and that will get us into the whole issue of sexual brokenness. So that would have been, I think, appropriate. That's something I hadn't really even thought about until you just said it right now. But part of the problem is always going to be that if you are in a society right now, and this almost leads to our next article we'll get to later, the fragile generation, if you define a rejection of a lifestyle as hate, then right off the bat, you're going to have difficulty, no matter how loving you are, no matter how gracious you are, trying to communicate that even though I affirm you as a person, because I have a homosexual uncle, and I've been around a number of individuals in the San Francisco Bay Area for years that were homosexual, but as I affirm you as a person, but I don't affirm your actions, that's enough to already get you being labeled as a hater. It didn't used to be that way. People could understand the concept between I love the person, but I hate the sin, but no longer, because now hate means that you will not affirm my lifestyle, which means you don't affirm me, which means you're a hater. And that's, I think, the difficulty, even when you're trying to be as gracious and loving as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think Todd Wagner, who's at Watermark Church, has probably put it best and probably most stinging for me, Chelsey, in the sense that, are you ready to be unpopular? And because at the end of the day, this is going to be one of those issues that makes Christians that struggle with that idea of wanting to please people, which is myself, and significantly, it's going to make you extremely unpopular for holding this view.
Well, you bring up a good point, but even worse than being unpopular, unemployed or sued, or put in prison. I mean, in Australia, that is the case. You can go to prison for up to 6 months for verbalizing a view that someone else finds offensive. And so I think that it's important also to make this in quantitative terms for the public, that there are people genuinely losing their jobs and their businesses over this. And we've seen that a lot in the news. And we have our own clients, the Kleins, who can't go in business anymore in the state of Oregon, because even though she was willing, as you mentioned, it doesn't matter how lovingly they do this, the Kleins actually did serve this lesbian couple before. They had served them for many events, but when it came to actually participating in the wedding or making what they viewed to be an artistic expression to celebrate that wedding that was opposed, their views wouldn't allow them to do, they got not only sued but gutted financially, and now even the state of Oregon refuses to let them partake in any business in the state.
Yeah. It's just such an interesting time that we live in, Kerby, that there's going to be a sense that it's going to be increasingly more difficult for Christians to be able to take a stand. And so if you could give any advice, I know that you do this day in and day out, what would your advice be to Christians that are really beginning to feel some of that resistance, beginning to feel some of that oppression?
Well, I was just thinking, first of all, that churches right now hearing this might want to at least begin to look at their doctrinal statement and their constitution. And in their doctrinal statement, they probably never felt the need to define marriage between one man and one woman. Everybody knew that. Well, if you have that in your doctrinal statement, and then you have in your constitution that we will not rent our facilities or make our facilities available to any couple that disagrees with our doctrinal statement, then you have covered yourself. If you're in business, I think you're really going to have to say it depends where we are. I've had people call in and say, in light of what happened to the Kleins in Oregon, is that going to happen to me? And I ask them, what state are you in? Georgia? Probably not. Tennessee? Probably not. California. Yep. I mean, it really is going to divide along red and blue states. And so this is where you're going to have to start thinking about this. But Chelsey raises a good question, because I did this a couple of years ago in a commentary. Think of all the jobs that Christians can't actually go into unless they want to run the risk of losing their job. Florist, wedding planner, photographer, pharmacist, counselor. I mean, I went down this long list, and in every case tried to cite at least one case in which a Christian, because he or she took a biblical stand, lost their job. That's pretty significant.
It is. It's very significant. Even lawyers now, the ABA is passing rules for attorneys on this front. So I would also say go to firstliberty.org. We have resources for how to conduct your own religious liberty audit, is what we call it, and it's a resource for how to go ahead and get these statements of faith in place, these doctrinal stances in place, and they're built for religious educational institutions of any level, churches, and then also any nonprofits, really.
Yeah, and so when we come back after this, I want to continue just to encourage two things. One, some of the stuff that Chelsey and First Liberty are working on right now, some really exciting cases that I think you all would be very interested in sharing. I've been privy to the information during a break, but we don't have these microphones on during break. But also to be able to know what's happening right now, to be able to know that you have rights and you have certain liberties, inalienable, that are a part of who you are and by who God has made you to be. And so you want to cling to those, as well as just a personal note, just to continue to not be discouraged, to grow weary in doing good. It's the sense that when we set our eyes upon Jesus, is what it says in Hebrews 12:1, that we set our eyes upon the author and the perfecter of our faith, and we won't grow weary of doing good, to recognize the truth that it's kindness that leads to repentance. And so individuals may slap us across the face with one side. We have the opportunity, one, to cling to the rights that we have because of our government, but also two, because of the spirit that's inside of us, to continue to do good in the face of it as well. And when we come back, we're going to hear updates on First Liberty, as well as move into this next article about the fragile generation. And we'll be back right after this.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And we are back on Point of View, and I am Nick Pitts, guest hosting today. And I have at the roundtable the one, the only, Kerby Anderson is to my left, and then also Miss Chelsey Youman from First Liberty Institute on my right. And we have been talking about everything from DACA to Christians and singles and the changing perceptions of love and marriage and horses and carriages. And then we kind of moved into the Nashville statement. And in the Nashville statement, we kind of started talking about the rights and the liberties that individuals have to exercise their freedom of religion in the workplace and in the marketplace as well. And wouldn't you know it, Chelsey Youman has a little bit of experience in that First Amendment right. And so, Chelsey, give us a kind of an update on what's happening right now over at First Liberty.
Sure. So we have in the First Amendment, we have the free exercise clause, which are some of our other cases you guys have probably heard about coming out of the appellate courts lately for the right to pray, for instance. So Marianne Sauce was told by police officers she could not pray in her own home when they arrived for a sound complaint. And we had that at the circuit court level and lost, and are looking to appeal to the Supreme Court. And then we had also the exercise rights category. Coach Kennedy was told he couldn't pray on the field after a football game, even if it was silently to himself for 30 seconds. So we have those two cases. But on the other side, in the First Amendment context, we have the Establishment Clause that, no Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. We've all heard that part. So others like to refer to it as separation of church and state, which isn't quite correct on how to quantify that law. But all that to say, we had a great and outstanding victory today out of the Sixth Circuit on the Establishment Clause front, which we represented Jackson County commissioners who have a brief invocation before opening their commissioner hearing every week. And we also represented a similar county commissioner out of Rowan County in the Fourth Circuit. We lost that case in July, and we won the exact same case, very, very similar set of facts, county commissioners having an invocation before the beginning of their hearings. We won that now in the Sixth Circuit, which means there's a circuit split. And even though the Supreme Court has decided this type of case twice, saying that legislative prayer, comports completely with our Constitution, we have a longstanding history of chaplains in the legislature opening with prayer. The Supreme Court says, God save the court. God forbid that we're allowed to say that in the court. We have a precedent on the books, and we still continue to see these challenges nationwide. And so we're hoping, maybe if there is an appeal, that we would get to the Supreme Court in that scenario. And then I have a case that's dear to my heart because it's my client, Judge Mack out of Montgomery County, Texas, who allows a volunteer chaplain to, he honors them for volunteering for the county in death call cases by allowing them to open his Justice of the Peace courtroom with a brief invocation. And so that, as far as we know, is the first in the judiciary that we've seen this legislative prayer judiciary in the judiciary challenged. And so we are seeing these pop up across our country. And it's just the time to say, is it still in our history? We have a long history of all three branches of government recognizing the role that religion plays in the public realm.
Yeah, that's so good. So I guess we can pray, Kerby. I guess we're still able to pray to a certain extent.
I guess we can, but again, don't do it in the Ninth Circuit or the 10th Circuit, it sounds like. No, I'm only being facetious. And the people will say, well, what can we do? First of all, I think you should support First Liberty. I've done this even long before Chelsey ever even worked there, and I've certainly followed what Kelly Shackelford and his whole team have done for years. But number two, I think we really do need to encourage our U.S. senators. We've got a problem right now. We have, I think it's up to almost 140 vacancies in the federal judiciary. And those individuals, if you put on individuals in these lifetime appointments to the federal judiciary that believe that things like prayer before a legislative session or a prayer in the 50-yard line or a prayer in your own home should be constitutional, you'll turn this around very quickly. You're going to make Chelsey's job a whole lot easier. So right now what we have is a roadblock that is created by some of these U.S. senators. And so I think we should be contacting our U.S. senators and say it's time to put judges on the court. And the kind of judges that are going to be put on the court that I think would be coming from people like Donald Trump and Mike Pence and others are going to be the kind of people that are going to actually agree with some of the things that the First Liberty lawyers have been trying to say for many years.
Yes, and we at First Liberty are even trying to take steps to make this as easy as possible for you. And so I'm probably selling it a little too early, but by this weekend, we're hoping to have a map on our website where you can see not only your senator's contact information, but what vacancies would have an effect on you if we were to get someone in that should be there. And then all the potential nominees will have some brief bios for that. So go ahead and go to First Liberty, hopefully by early next week, and be able to see who to contact to get support.
Kelly did mention that last week, and I think the fact that he'll be on Friday, we'll probably have it up, if not then, by Saturday. And so, again, that's another way to find that out. We also have that link that we mentioned just a minute ago if people want to do a religious audit of your church. And until we get to the point where we have right-thinking judges in the court, it seems to me that you need to do some preemptive action. And the resources, the church resource, you wrote those, didn't you? So again,
I did every single line.
So there, if you want to read the great writing of Chelsey, there you are. It's right there on the first
225 years of precedent.
There you go.
Well,
So-
way to go. Way to go.
Isn't that something?
There it is.
Yeah.
There it is. So be sure to check out firstliberty.org. Firstliberty.org, am I correct? Firstliberty.org to be able to take the assessment, to be able to see what are the steps that you need to be taking, you and your organization, in order to secure your rights, but also to be able to exercise those rights in the marketplace. And then 2, to be able to see who do you need to be calling besides Ghostbusters should you have a problem, and what senator you need to be calling, and then petitioning as well. You can find both of those on First Liberty, because it's just an interesting world that we're living in today, that individuals are, I guess you could birth them.
That's something.
And so then it brings us to the third article, and you can find that article on pointofview.net. It was out of, it's called The Fragile Generation. And increasingly, you've heard us talk about pretty recently as well. It's just pretty often this sense that this millennial generation is one that has kind of coined the idea of microaggressions, have coined the idea of trigger warnings. And now Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor out of New York University, has really just done a phenomenal work of talking about how this, specifically one of the things I want to talk about first, Kerby, is the phenomenon that's known as concept creep, where things that were once violent because of what they did to me, specifically sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, today that's not true, because words can hurt us.
Well, and again, I sort of alluded to that a while back when I said that the word hate had been sort of redefined, but certainly violence is another one, because he said concept creep is where, again, it's been happening since the 1990s, when a word like violence is allowed to creep so that it includes a lot of things that are not violent. And the same kind of thing. If you say, well, you're doing violence to me, I'm going, I haven't touched you. I'm not even 5 feet away from you. Yes, but words you said did violence to me. And again, as the old one around the table, I remember when we could speak really bluntly sometimes on the college campuses in the 1970s when I first started doing that. I mean, there was a lot of give and take. There were free speech forums. There were people shouting down and all the rest, even into the 1980s. But eventually it got to be too violent, because some of the things you were saying about sex or marriage or about intelligent design or politics or whatever it might be. And so as a result, there's a good example of concept creep, where violence now no longer just means doing a violent act towards a person.
Yeah, and Chelsey, being the mother that's around the table, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. He talks about how in the article that there's a sense that we want to protect, that parents want to protect their children from certain harm. But we also know it to be true that there's certain things, difficulties that we go through, conflicts that we endure through, that are very character forming. That Ben Sass would even go so far as to say that that the scars build character. And so can you help me understand the balance from a mother's perspective of, 1, wanting to protect your child, but also 2, recognizing that there is an extent that you need to allow them to walk through it?
Right. I think you're so right. You're hitting on what Frank Ferretti says. He's a professor out of sociology out of University of Kent in Canterbury. And so out of England, they're having a similar issue. I thought that this might be, an American-centric problem, but it sounds like it's an international phenomenon as well. And it goes to what you're saying. He's attributing the deep personalization of ideas, right, to what he says is we're psychologizing independence. So in your struggle to gain independence and to gain understanding of who you are, and what you're saying is building your character and to kind of develop your sense of self at that early age, we've now psychologized it, and it's become what he's saying a psychological issue. So if I'm hurt by someone, then I'm depressed, and internalizing perhaps too deeply others' ideas and opinions. And when I think as a mother, even as my son is only 9 months old, I want him to have that sense of independence and fearlessness and to be brave. And I want him to go, exploring in new ways and to understand the world that works around him, but also understand his place in the world. I think that's healthy to do. So we're stunting the millennials' ability to do that when we psychologize it.
That's really good. And so when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about this and this idea that we're in a fragile generation. Feel free to call in at 800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1987, the Supreme Court was asked whether timbering operations within a national park over a portion of land traditionally used for religious purposes by Native Americans violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. Justice O'Connor's opinion in Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association concluded that, quote, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the land in question did not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land, unquote. But not all the justices agreed. Justice Brennan, joined by Justices Marshall and Blackmun, disagreed. He reasoned that the timbering in question threatened the, quote, very existence of a Native American religion. He concluded on a somber note, quote, today the court holds that a federal land use decision that promises to destroy an entire religion does not burden the practice of that faith in a manner recognized by the Free Exercise Clause. I find it difficult, however, to imagine conduct more insensitive to religious needs, unquote. 13 years later, Congress would pass the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. At the least, RLUIPA would have required the government to demonstrate that its actions were the least restrictive in pursuit of a compelling government interest. RLUIPA, like RFRA, insists that government actions substantially burdening the free exercise of religion receive heightened scrutiny. That protects all of our religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View for this last little stretch, and I'm joined by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman, and we've been talking about the fragile generation, Jonathan Haidt's article that's posted on our website at pointofview.net that you can find there. And so, Kerby, I'm a big fan of free-range chicken, especially when it's in a bowl at Chipotle. I'm kind of
there you go.
I'm a risk taker, and then I still go to Chipotle. So tell us about free-range kids.
That is a book, and I always have trouble with his name, Leonore Skenazy, I think is right, Skenazy. Anyway, wrote the book, Free Range Kids. And what the problem is that when you have a whole generation that is protected from dangers, and again, let's talk about the positives, baby on board, buckling them up, bicycle helmets, I get that. That's all good. But when you protect them from hostile ideas, contrary ideas, here's the problem. Skenazy says in his book, Free Range Kids, that we have made our children too safe to succeed. And this gets back to this interchange of ideas. The university, at the very least, and I think high school and even grade school, but certainly the university should be a place where contrary ideas are give and take. And I would imagine all three of us at one time or another got involved with the debate club on a high school campus or did some kind of interaction. And so to have this culture now say, no, we're only going to say and teach those things which are politically correct. We're not going to ever look at contrary ideas. We've created a generation of young people, maybe not you sitting around the table, but a lot of others, that just simply cannot handle diversity, cannot handle false ideas or different ideas or contrary ideas. And so as a result, that's why I said we've made our kids too safe to be successful in the real world.
And Haidt does this. Chelsey Haidt gives the illustration of the immune system, for example, in the article. And he talks about how the immune system, it needs that conflict. It needs that contrarian, those germs to be able to get stronger. But increasingly what we're seeing is there's this homogeneous, we only allow one particular voice that echoes our voice that's already existent in the culture. And it really does do a detriment because it doesn't strengthen us.
Yes, it causes what we could call an arrested development of an entire generation. But no, that's true that there's been a delayed childhood, I think, is what they're calling it. They're saying 15-year-olds are now like 13-year-olds, and now 18-year-olds are like 16-year-olds, if I can do the math right. But the issue is that they're in an echo chamber, like you said, and so they're not being exposed to these other ideas. They're not being challenged. But the other thing is they might not be able to thrive in a workplace where it is a little bit more of a dog-eat-dog world out there. You're going to receive constructive, hopefully, but sometimes just criticism from employers. You're going to have to be able to be tenacious enough to deal with that. And even with our interns at First Liberty, you know, we really do. We have wonderful, wonderful interns, and I'm always waiting to see these effects come through, and I never really do. But our interns really have it together, actually. But, you know, we have to tell them, hey, we are Christians here, and we have a Christian environment and are going to treat you with respect. But you might end up at a law firm where that's not always the case, and there is a partner who's going to throw a book at you. I've seen it happen before, not at First Liberty, at another law firm context, but just to be able to articulate your ideas and handle constructive criticism and become better in a world that's going to be required of you.
That's so great. Like I mentioned yesterday, I was back on my old college campus, Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, and Dr. White is the president there, and she was such a First Amendment person. She very much just wants to have this free exchange of ideas. And as I was making my way towards the kind of room, auditorium where we were having our conversation, it was so interesting because we were passing by another classroom that I just have a vivid memory of being proven wrong. I know that comes as a shock to our listeners that I could have been proven wrong, but in a shocking twist, I am woefully ignorant, and especially more so when I was in college. And it was just brought back, like, even just that moment that I was proven wrong in front of all of my classmates still has this influence on me and still brings up this feeling inside of me that I think I know is for the betterment of me, to help me see the error of my ways and the error of my thinking, and then also be corrected by it. And Kerby, increasingly, we're just not seeing this on college campuses anymore, that there can't be this exchange of ideas that where we can be proven wrong, because now we're just forcing our beliefs upon individuals.
And this is where we're starting to see a separation, because right now, both of you are saying, well, this isn't necessarily me. And lots of times I'll have people say, you know, I love Chelsey and Nick, but they're not the typical millennials. I said, well, in some respects, maybe are not. This is the same thing on college campuses. There was recently a list of all these conservative campuses, and I know some of these, you know, whether it's the Dominican Franciscan ones, whether it's Hillsdale, or whether it's Grove City College, or whatever it might be. And those are places that still allow for some of that interchange. And many of them are conservative, some of them are Christian, some of them aren't necessarily anything, but they still allow that to take place. Then you have the others where it's a complete enforcement of an ideology and, if you will, total indoctrination. And so what you're going to have, I think, in your generation and the next generation, are you're still going to have your thinkers. The best and the brightest are still going to be the best and the brightest, but you're going to have this mass of other individuals that are functionally illiterate, culturally illiterate, obviously biblically illiterate, and this is kind of the world that we find ourselves in now in the 21st century.
And it's increasingly more necessary for us to have workers that can think on their own, right? The average individual, average American will stay at their particular firm or job for 4.3 years. automation and innovation are going to revolutionize the workforce now, and it's going to cause more and more individuals to change jobs throughout their career. That can just think about this for I was telling this thought experiment with my dad on the way to the airport this morning, that there are roughly over, I think, 1 million truckers in the U.S. today. In 5 to 10 years, those truckers are not going to have a job because there's going to have the chance to self-driving trucks now. And so what are they going to do? It's going to be increasingly important for them to have schooling and training necessary to be able to understand, one, what they do, to know thyself, and then two, be able to have the cognitive functions necessary to be trained for a new particular type of job. And that a large part of that comes through this free exchange of ideas. And in the free exchange of ideas, sticks and stones break your bones. Yes, believe me, I've fallen off a tree, and they do break your bones. But then also, words have the ability to hurt you, but in the long run, they help you as well. Right, Chelsey?
That's right. And I think we need to distinguish between just words and the sharing of ideas and sharing and really vetting your moral compass. Mm-hmm. And your standards and your morality and your system of ethics. Because what Ferretti was getting at out of Canterbury, he was saying parents used to instill ideas of codes of ethics and morality with their children, and now instead a lot of our society has lost that code of ethics, and instead they're instilling things of affirmation, ideas and affirmation in the students. And so students aren't able, if it's not feeding their sense of self and affirmation, there's no underlying ethics to replace that, and so they can't even have that dialogue. And I think a lot of times we say, a lot of dialogue is important to be able to challenge yourself, but it's also to challenge yourself to know what you believe and why, and to really be fundamental in your faith.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're just about out of time, and I wanted to mention one thing. You mentioned those resources, and we did have a link the other day to them. So if you want to find those, again, First Liberty, click on that button that says resources, right? So that they can find some of those. I just want to mention that before we run out of time.
Yeah, and use those resources to be able to know the rights that you have, to be able to exercise those rights, those religious rights that you have in the marketplace as well. And then relative to your speech, to make sure that you stand for truth, but also recognize stand for truth with grace. And so, Kerby, what do we have coming on tomorrow? What's happening on the show tomorrow?
Rob Peabody has been with us before, and he's put together an app that allows you to go online and find out where you can actually serve right now. So if you would like to serve those with Hurricane Harvey, you can find those in your community. If you'd like to serve somebody in the community, and he used to be over in England, but he's brought this here to the United States to just allow you to begin to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. So he's one of many guests that I'll have on tomorrow.
That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. And so with that, we say thank you so much for joining us. And this is Chelsey Youman. Thank you so much for joining us from First Liberty. Kerby, thank you so much for giving up your chair. And I am Nick Pitts. And be sure to tune in tomorrow and to hear more. We'll see you then.
A farmer will tell you that if you don't prepare the ground, if you never plant good seeds, don't expect a harvest. Weeds maybe, edible crop no. Achieving a positive result takes work and planning. If you're concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, in the halls of government, let me ask, have you invested in pulling weeds and planting seeds? That's what the Truth Team at Point of View does. For decades, God has used this team to attack noxious mental weeds and to plant seeds of truth that have grown into changed lives. If you're already giving to this effort each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to